Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our Toward Life 3.0 series. My name is Matthias Risser, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I am welcoming you also on behalf of Sushma Raman, who is our executive director and who will join us at the Q&A stage later. Now, the title of our series we take from Max Tegmark's fascinating book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. The goal of this series is to explore ethical and human rights-related issues that arise in the course of technological innovation that is happening all around us and might eventually take us to a full-fledged Life 3.0, a phase of life populated by entities that get to design both their culture, their software, so to speak, and their bodies, their hardware. We do not know if that kind of life will ever emerge or when, but we also don't want to start thinking about its ethical dimensions only once it's clear that it will indeed emerge. And in any event, there are plenty of such ethics and human rights related challenges all around us already that occur as part of technological innovation. And that already takes me to our topic today, Algorithms of Oppression, a conversation with Dr. Safiya Umoja Noble. Let me just give a few words of background to this topic. Technology of sorts has always been essential to human life. And our most common way of thinking about technology is that it is a vast array of tools that assists in our tasks, that by itself is morally neutral, and that we might just as well not use. But one of the key insights that's come out of the philosophy of technology and out of science, technology, and society studies in recent times is that this straightforward understanding of technology is actually enormously misguided. Instead, technology mediates all our experiences with the world, and it mediates all our relationships with each other. And therein lies a lot of power. There lies a lot of power in the design of such mediation. This is true, for instance, and quite obviously so for transportation technology and urban design, which shape how people get to move around and who gets to move where and by what means. And it is also and especially true for information technology. Information technology determines how information is channeled, who gets access to what kind of information, and how information is prioritized. The pioneering media scholar Marshall McLuhan was famous for saying that the medium is the message. The medium is the message. What he meant was that the media of information conveyance by themselves set the stage for human interaction. And in a deeper way, all this also means that what kind of human life we get to live and what kind of self-understanding we have of ourselves in the first place is shaped very much by technology. To think of technology merely as a disconnected tool, set of tools throws away these insights. And that standpoint also blinds us to how use of technology is a way of creating and perpetuating injustices in society, to how access to technology bestows power in some and takes it away from others. There's nothing neutral about technology, really. And everybody who thinks it's optional for them whether or not to use the kind of technology that they do in fact use on a day-to-day basis, you should try the self-experiment and see what happens to you and to your communications and to your relationships if you stop using it. And that use of technology and here think Google, Facebook, Instagram, and the likes is not effectively optional, only increases the ways in which technology is a site of power. Now, in recent years, a number of voices have drawn attention to these phenomena and brought them to the attention of a larger public, specifically in the domain of digital technologies, and here specifically regarding how power is exercised in and through digital technologies to perpetuate and even increase economic, gender, or race-based disadvantage. One may think here of Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, or Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction, Virginia Eubank's Automating Inequality, or of course Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And then, of course, one of the most important of these voices is also that of Safiya Noble, a professor of media studies and African American studies at UCLA, and author of the hugely insightful book, Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. This is a book about the power of algorithms in the age of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has delegated much decision-making in society to markets, and one implication of that has been that it actually becomes profitable for private actors to develop information technologies that echo and reinforce oppressive social relationships. Among other things, Safiya has written of technological redlining, which implies, for instance, that people of color are more likely to pay higher interest rates or premiums just because they are Black or Latino, especially if they live in low-income neighborhoods. And then to stick with those groups, what you or they themselves learn about them if you just Google, right, as we have come to say, if we just Google something, is a matter of the kind of prioritizing that Google, the company, a huge company, assigns to particular bits of information. So there's an enormous exercise of power right there. So we're very grateful to have Safiya with us today, and I will turn right over to her now, and Safiya will talk to us for about 20 minutes about her book, but also about the kind of work she has done ever since. And then Sushma and I will back for Q&A, for a conversation with Safiya. And the audience, you who are watching this on YouTube, please do put your questions in the YouTube question channel, and we will be streaming that. We will be screening that, and we will integrate some of your questions into our conversation later. And now, without further ado, welcome, Safiya, all over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just so honored to get to participate in this conversation with you today. And you really framed the discussion and the issues so powerfully. I was thinking as I was listening to you speak, what's left to say, quite honestly. I mean, in many ways, the things that you've outlined are indeed the prescient questions of the day. So let me just maybe share a little bit for people who are watching about my work and this book that I happen to have a little stack of books here that I wanted to share out about as well. This book, Algorithms of Oppression, really came about as an inquiry into what it means for large privately held corporations, advertising platforms, indeed, to encroach so powerfully upon the realm of kind of information provision or knowledge provision in society. I started my career early on, kind of out of undergrad, working in the field of kind of corporate social responsibility. And then I moved into more direct advertising and marketing jobs, focusing on multicultural and urban consumers. And when I was in the advertising and marketing fields, I was, this was kind of as search engines were coming into prominence. And, I'd been on the internet for a very long time. In fact, I think I got my first email from some friends in the National Society of Black Engineers when I was an undergrad at Fresno State, who I think gave me my first email in somewhere around 1989. And I remember thinking, who would ever want to sit at a computer all day and type? Like, that just sounds atrocious. So obviously I was not good at predicting tech trends back then. But, I will say that this notion of how the world of information and technology is shaped such that we cannot opt out, or that when we try to opt out, there are consequences, is really one of the things that led me to thinking more deeply about the research that led to this book, Algorithms of Oppression. Now, when I was in advertising, before I left the field and went back to graduate school, I like to think that I went to graduate school to kind of atone for my sins. That's, those of us who have worked in advertising and marketing know that that's a tough field to work in, and to spend one's life kind of really trying to engage the public in believing in products, in believing in services, in finding them essential and necessary to one's life, to one's identity. And this, at the time that I was kind of getting ready to leave the industry, we were actively working in this kind of nascent field of search engine optimization. It wasn't even really called SEO yet. It was more like sitting around and figuring out how do we game the systems so that our clients' products and services make it to the first page of Google or to Yahoo, so that consumers would relate to those links on the first page as having been vetted by the search engine company, right? By the technology company, and therefore see them as more credible and more reliable than traditional advertising. We kind of knew that if people found something in a search engine pretty high up to the top, that they would take that even more seriously than they might take, let's say, a television ad. So this idea of thinking about search, knowing this disconnect, and then going to graduate school with this kind of on my mind in the background, and wondering, what does it mean when minoritized communities, particularly kind of racial and ethnic groups in the United States, lose control over the way in which they're represented in knowledge systems? Of course, I was thinking about this in both traditional knowledge systems like the library, but also in other kinds of pseudo knowledge systems like search engines, where the public might think of them as like reliable information, again, kind of arbiters. But really, those of us who'd worked closely around tech and kind of advertising technologies understood them for what they were, which is advertising platforms. And so this disconnect between how the public engages with search versus other kinds of knowledge regimes like libraries, for example, or universities, K through 12, teachers, books, museums, archives. This kind of the intersection of these tensions is really what led to the development of the research agenda that I've taken up. And so Algorithms of Oppression is really a book that helps us reimagine the way we think about search engines. I find this exceptionally important. You know, even though this book came out a couple of years ago, it came out really after we started to understand, for example, the role of companies like, you know, and again, I think of kind of like ad tech companies like Cambridge Analytica, which had really quite efficiently targeted consumers with certain types of propaganda in order to influence and suppress voters in the United States, in the UK, and in other parts of the world. And we understood Cambridge Analytica in the context of social media, that social media companies like Facebook and Twitter could be powerfully manipulated or work in these extremely kind of manipulative and dangerous ways in society. But it still remains surprising to me the degree to which Google and its products, maybe not so much YouTube, but certainly search, has kind of remained under the radar. And I think one of the things that's so important when we study what happens in search engines is that we discover that there are kind of a few things at play. First, those with the most capital, the most resources are really able to control particular narratives in search. And by that, I mean they're able to make some things more visible than others. This is very important because I think the majority of people, in the way that they relate to search engines, is they think that search engines are democracy. They think that what shows up at the top of a search engine ranked list is purely a reflection of society. This is what the majority of people are searching for, and this is why it shows up at the top. And of course, this book does a lot to kind of unpack that mythology. And here, you know, I think of the brilliant work of people like Matthew Hinman, who wrote The Myth of Digital Democracy, right? Helping us understand how super political action committees, super PACs are able to, with their resources, control the narrative about political candidates, for example. I mean, that work far predates the 2016 presidential election. But those logics are absolutely at play in something like a search engine. I'm also trying to help people understand that even if they believe that democracy is the underlying logic of something like search, which again, I can't underscore enough, unlike social media, where we have a lot of attention right now on disinformation and propaganda and misinformation moving through those spaces, even as people come into contact with that and might raise an eyebrow and say, I'm not sure about the veracity of this source, they turn to a search engine like a fact checker. So this relationship in the ecosystem between, let's say, social media platforms and search engine platforms is very, very important. And one of the things that I indeed closed the book out as the book was going to press, I show that how a news story that went viral in the immediate days following the 2016 US presidential election, when you did a search on final election result, for example, the very first hit in Google was a disinformation site that showed you a tweet that reported out that Donald Trump had won the popular vote. Now, we know that is not true. We know that Hillary Clinton indeed won the popular vote by more than 3 million votes. And Donald Trump had won the Electoral College. Now, this is crucial if we fast forward to the contemporary moment. And again, the way that people are engaging with search, like a fact checker, like an arbiter, a credibility meter, all of the kinds of ways. And of course, again, these the way in which search can be so easily manipulated. And part of the reason why people don't understand how that's happening is because they don't understand AdWords or keyword planning tools or the ways in which so many different companies and industries and individual players are using keyword planning tools in various platforms to optimize content and make it more visible, which means those who pay the most are really able to capture certain kinds of keywords. Now, in the case of, here, on the cover of this book, it's so interesting to me. This is an actual search that I did. This is kind of showing the failure of something like auto completion, right? Which was a kind of a new product that was introduced while I was writing this book. When you typed in, why are Black women so, Google would auto suggest angry, loud, mean, attractive, lazy, annoying, confident, sassy, insecure, right? So if we think about the way in which people's ideas are influenced in authoritatively, seemingly neutral and benign ways. I mean, this is like, the way I would think about like how hegemony, for example, might work. There are so many consequences to the ways in which vulnerable people, minoritized people, children, people of color, even women in the majority of the population still cannot control the way in which they're misrepresented in these systems. And at a time when other kinds of democratic institutional counterweights to search engines might exist, like public libraries, universities, K through 12 schools, public media organizations, all of these are under threat in the United States right now. And in fact, some of them are collapsing indeed at this moment of COVID-19, where there's just an excruciating kind of lack of resource that can be put into these important democratic institutions around the country. At that moment that's happening, where those kinds of organizations, which could serve as other kinds of resources to the public, the resources that indeed are missing to buttress them are not being paid by way of taxes by big tech into the public's coffers, which is so important. We want to remember that this sector that is probably the most well-capitalized and profitable industries in the world does not pay its fair share back into the systems, right? So the kind of lack of payment of taxes, the offshoring of profits rather than investing them back into the cities, states, and nations where these companies do business, they indeed offshore them into, accounts, offshore accounts, and tax havens. So we and the conditions of repatriation of those profits back into the United States requires that those payments, for example, would just go out to shareholders, right, rather back into the publics, from which, quite frankly, the extraction of our attention and our data bolsters these companies, makes these companies profitable. So the book is really an attempt to try to unpack some of this phenomena, what's happening there. I'll say that, more recently, maybe as I kind of bring some of these thoughts to a close and open up our conversation, when I was writing this book, there were really just a handful. I truly stand on the shoulders of the women of color who've been writing critically about the tech industry for 20 years in different ways about kind of racist representation. I was trying to argue that structurally, these technologies are implicated in bolstering things like structural racism, patriarchy, right, inequalities, global social inequality. They are deeply implicated in the way they structure that. And they do that all the way to the level of code and the way in which they imagine their technologies and services to work, and the baked in kind of discrimination that happens, or the possibilities for discrimination to emanate from the logics of their technologies. But also, to do that a decade ago was incredibly difficult. I mean, there weren't these kinds of conversations, as you know, right, where we could talk about and interrogate the human rights violations, the civil rights violations of the way in which these platforms of varying types operate in the world. And that, I think, was really amazing to see that now, 10 years later, we can have these conversations. We actually have whole new fields that have emerged around AI and ethics. It's disheartening, I have to say, to see, I was just looking over some materials today and looking at engineering schools, for example, that are trying to hire AI and ethics professors to teach in computer science, with just kind of like a total disregard for all of the women of color and the people of color, and the influence of fields like African American studies, fields like human rights and law, fields like kind of feminist science and technology studies, that have even created the conditions for our ability to have these conversations. So I just want to recenter that doing this work, having these conversations at the Carr Center, is very important, because it's actually part of the longstanding tradition of foregrounding people in these conversations about technology and technological harm, which is very different than foregrounding the technology and how to tweak and fix technology or tweak and fix algorithms. All of these systems work within the boundaries of people, what people can imagine, and the differential ways in which people experience the societies that they live in based on the color of their skin, the caste they're born into, the class they're born into, whether they are born into a racialized ethnic minority, a religious minority, a sexual minority. So these things are really important, that we always kind of recenter the conversations about what technology is doing in the context of social structure and rights. And so maybe that's a place to kind of open up the conversation for us, and just say, again, I'm just so grateful to get to think about and imagine possibilities related to these crises in the world right now.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Safiya, and thank you to our audience for joining us. And I'm going to just get the conversation started, and we welcome people in the audience to also post your questions. And so I guess one question I have, given the current moment that we're in, is that in the wake of the protests that occurred across the country over the last few months, after the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and, countless other Black people at the hands of police and vigilantes, many companies, including technology companies, came out with statements around Black Lives Matter and what they were doing, in terms of, I guess, trying to promote their corporate image. And so what are your thoughts about what these companies should be doing? A lot of effort is poured into sort of these diversity and inclusion efforts, or perhaps even corporate philanthropy. But what exactly should tech companies be doing in order to be addressing these concerns that around technological redlining and algorithmic oppression?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. And indeed, it's been very difficult for Black faculty and Black employees and Black students and staffers in all kinds of institutions around the country to see our organizations make all kinds of pledges around the support of Black life, while indeed we languish in these organizations, right, and suffer from institutional racism in the companies and the institutions that we work in. So this has been a challenge just on the kind of lack of recognition that right where we are, these problems are not out there. These problems are in the interior of the organizations that we work on and work in. And I think that companies have, unfortunately, in many ways, capitalized off of Black Lives Matter in order to bolster their brands because the zeitgeist has changed. When millions of people are in the streets demanding that Black Lives Matter, when the NBA or the NFL reverse their positions, or, with respect to Black athletes, and when celebrities and people with influence are able to lend their voice to the struggle for racial justice, companies want to get in on that, right? So of course we're seeing that. And one of the more challenging, I think, responses that I saw was in the case of Microsoft and Amazon in particular, responding to with a kind of ban on facial recognition, right? A moratorium or bans or pauses in their, there were varying degrees of response. That, kind of an acknowledgement that facial recognition technologies, particularly as they're used and weaponized against Black people. And of course, one of the reasons we know about the failures of that facial recognition is because of the work that Black women scholars did, Timnit Gebru, Joy Bowamini, their work between MIT Media Lab and Timnit's work at Google really helped us understand that these technologies of facial recognition were incredibly harmful and damaging. They don't recognize Black faces and Black women's faces in particular. And that when you put them against, let's say when you run those software systems across the Black faces, the African-American members of the Congressional Black Caucus, for example, it will mismatch them into criminal databases. So they've done some very important studies that have been amplified by the ACLU, for example. And that work has been very important. What we saw was these companies kind of capitalize on that research and engage in publicity. What I felt were publicity stunts. Not everybody agrees with that, but I felt that they were kind of publicity stunts to say, we'll take a pause on facial recognition, research and development, or sales. But, fundamentally, those companies are also providing kind of like private label, white label technologies to law enforcement, and don't even necessarily engage in a lot of direct sales to law enforcement agencies, right? And what they could have done was indeed recall those softwares, right? Those systems that are already deeply embedded in law enforcement, and said, these, until we have further study, we're not going to weaponize facial recognition against Black Lives Matter protesters or environmental climate science protesters, right? Or Occupy protesters of the past. I mean, this is where these technologies get tried out, quite frankly, in Hong Kong, in places in the world where people are really trying to struggle around human and civil rights. So I think this is one of the ways in which we have to be, we have to stay alert and keep our eyebrows raised when we see companies try to, allege that they're walking away from some of their bread and butter products. Are they? And what other mechanisms might we need, especially in terms of the law, to again recall or abolish some of these technologies that I think are mostly used in incredibly harmful ways, anti-democratic ways.
Thank you. It's interesting that you bring up this topic of how to hold companies accountable who are now making all these pledges, because we have this other series here at the Carr Center on economic justice at the intersection between to racial justice, which we always do on Thursdays. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a colleague here from Harvard University, Brandon Terry, who works at the intersection of academia and also social movements. And one of his initiatives is to actually to create an organization that keeps track of all these pledges, that organizations are now making in light of Black Lives Matter, and just to kind of see how that unfolds and possibly to unleash some naming and shaming mechanisms in the future if that doesn't happen. But what I actually wanted to do is to switch topics a little bit. It's interesting that Sushma started with companies. So to ask you about companies, since in a way that says a lot about where we are in this country with thinking about the future of of technology, AI, anything, search engines, and the bigger picture from there. It is very much with companies, right? But that is also already a reflection of the fact that there's largely an abdication of regulatory interest on the side of the government, which creates this very bizarre situation that, on the one hand, we have these massive tech companies, these tech companies that for years have been bigger than any energy company of old, coming out of the Gilded Age has ever been. And not only are they bigger than those, they are basically doing much of the world production in technologies, at least, outside of China and the Chinese context. On the other hand, we have certainly, since the end of the Obama administration, this largely a lack of interest and regulatory efforts here. In the last year of Obama, when there was a pretty strong scientific advisory council in the White House, they kind of started that. Obama had a few white papers, but then this all fell by the wayside. So we have this massive discrepancy between technology being produced, power of companies, and lack of regulatory effort on the side of the government. So, and then my question there is, so if so let's say there were a change in the administration, we have a different incoming administration under Joe Biden, what are you hoping? If you could speak to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and say, this is what needs to change, what would you say?
Well, it's true. I mean, I had really held out a little bit of hope that we might enter a stronger regulatory environment, or that could be created. And it was difficult because I think there was great hope with the Obama administration that could be a possibility, but we also know that administration closely aligned itself with tech and tech leadership. And so that was a bit of a captured administration in terms of big tech's leadership and their influence in the White House and in Congress. And so, on one hand, I mean, we have to remember that President Obama was the social media president. He was the first social media president, right? So this is always one of the challenges, is that we have to, I think about big tech in terms of consequences and affordances, which is one of the ways I try to teach it to my students, is to just say that's a good, bad framework isn't sufficient. It's too limiting. We have to think about like what is lost and what is gained. So of course that, we had the presidency of Barack Obama due in part to big tech. At the same time, we've had many consequences through the weaponization of the very same mechanisms that he used to get elected. And we see that, unfolding in the current administration. So one of the challenges here, I think, too, is that we have not framed sufficiently the conversation more broadly than Section 230, which of course has been the primary mechanism of stressing how change needs to happen. And of course, this is about how tech platforms absolve themselves of responsibility for the media content that moves through their platforms, right? They kind of use Section 230, which basically says they're not responsible for that content, right? They are not publishers. Now this, I think, is getting obviously a lot of scrutiny right now, especially in law schools. Law professors have really taken up Section 230. My colleague, Sarah Roberts, who's the co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, she has spent a lot of time writing about Section 230 and beyond, because not only do we have to revisit whether these platforms are indeed publishers, whether they are indeed responsible for the content that moves through their platforms, which of course we know they must be. So there's no question, I think, among critics that now how far and to what degree, that's still up for a lot of debate. But one of the places that we haven't been looking in terms of regulation is well, kind of two places. One of the things I say in the book is the Federal Trade Commission, consumer harm and consumer safety have to be brought into the regulatory kind of purview. I think Commissioner Rohit Chopra has been a tremendous advocate. You know, he has taken on people who have used, software to discriminate, and is very deeply committed to studying these things like technological redlining, or as my colleague Chris Gilliard, who is in fact a fellow right now at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. He talks about this as digital redlining, and his work is quite brilliant. I recommend people check him out. We have to look at consumer harm and consumer safety and discrimination as part of the regulatory framework. We might even want to, again, when the administration makes right, when there is an administration who's open to these conversations, maybe the Department of Justice also has to be involved in part of the framework of thinking about civil and human rights violations, right? So there are many ways in which I think we need to activate around regulation that go beyond maybe the kind of narrow, more conservative sphere that I think has been thought about just with Section 230. So those would be, again, I think we've got to look at some of the discourse about harm doesn't match the evidence. So, for example, are certain types of voices, I mean, some of the same arguments that I make about the loss of civil and human rights, or the encroachment upon civil and human rights that happens for people of color and for ethnic minoritized people, get weaponized and used by the far right and by white nationalists. And I think we have to really, again, embed what are the values that are central to democracy. If racism is one of the values that we're going to say has as much potency as anti-racism, then we're in trouble when we think about regulation, because that just doesn't even make any sense. Or if anti-democratic fascist tendencies are just as legitimate and valid as human rights or sovereign rights models of thinking about how we organize society, those two things are in deep contradiction. And I think that policymakers have really been misguided in some ways as they're trying to think about policy, or they're just really flattening the values conversation in the regulatory regimes, and we need to keep illuminating and enriching that with evidence. And I think that's a really important dimension of the work that we're all doing.
So one of our other colleagues here at the Kennedy School, Sheila Jasanoff, has called for a global observatory on gene editing as a way to bring in scholars, but also people from different disciplines to really reflect on these very rapid scientific advances and implications for society. And I'm wondering whether, in addition to thinking about sort of legal or technocratic solutions, whether there needs to be this more global space for reasoned debate and coalition building, because really the reach of such technology companies is global. It's not purely within the purview of the United States. And I'm wondering your thoughts on something like that, or other ways in which people can, discuss these issues in the public sphere and expand opportunities for action.
There's no doubt that I think, non-governmental organizations, civic society organizations, activist organizations are playing a very important role in framing the issues and shaping the debate. And so all of these conversations really can't just be left to the tech industry to sort out among themselves. We see some of the failures of that in things like the Facebook Oversight Board, where this board was called for on behalf of kind of civic society organizations and civil society organizations. I struggle with that word, that framing, civil society. I think it's limited, but let's just use that generically here to say people who aren't in industry. Putting pressure after people seeing the way in which Facebook was weaponized during the 2016 presidential election, and that board really never even convening, right? Facebook appointing its own oversight board. Now, this has been the tendency here over the last, let's say 4 or 5 years, where industry is saying, well, we'll just self-govern. Of course, we know what happened when other industries, like let's say fossil fuels, decided that they would self-govern, right? That didn't go so well for the climate and for the public. So I think we want to definitely raise many eyebrows and push back on this idea that the industry can kind of self-govern and self-coordinate internationally. There are obviously bodies, the EU in particular, but also the United Nations, I think, has started to take up and look more seriously at this kind of intersection of harm and technology. I think here of the work of our UN Special Rapporteur, who's here at the UCLA Law School, Tendai Achiome, who has done remarkable work. Her work as the rapporteur on race, racism, xenophobia, and migration has really been instrumental. We've worked very closely together, her work at the Promise Institute at UCLA and the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA, working to kind of really put a finer point on how international policymakers need to be thinking about harm at the intersection of race and technology and immigration, right? So there is work afoot. I think people are doing this in many different quarters. I know that, the Carr Center also, kind of your influence. We have a responsibility, I think, broadly to help policymakers better understand. And of course, Oxford, a lot of the places that you would imagine are trying to inform policymakers better about the issues so that the only inputs aren't indeed coming just from the sector, which really has been the prevailing kind of, disposition of policymakers, is like, let's call it. You see the difference just in a few years now in the United States, what these antitrust hearings look like, with the next one coming up on October 28th. It's shocking because a few years ago, it would be, I loved the memes that were out on the internet about what was happening when, tech industry CEOs were brought in before Congress. And, there was like this great meme of a senator holding up, again, it's just a great meme, holding up a floppy disk and saying, now, who Facebook are your competitors? If I use these like 40 hours of free AOL, is this the same as Facebook? So hilarious to me. So we've come a long way. Now we have a very, robust kind of antitrust set of hearings that are kind of going on. So we'll have to keep the pressure on. And again, I think our role as scholars is to provide the evidence and really show where the harms are and help with kind of framing and also getting a long view, as Matthias is in your introductory remarks, understanding other industries, other moments in time where we've had to think crucially about what a sector is doing. I think it's really important for us to do that. And the only thing I would add in terms of the sense of urgency is that, now when you look at the work, let's say, of scholars who were studying the environment and climate, now many of them say, what we did was we provided the research. We showed the evidence of climate change. We gave it to policymakers, but they regret that they weren't more pointed, that they weren't more actively involved in really trying to help shape policy. They thought that if they just provided the evidence, that would be sufficient, that the policymakers would know what to do with it. And I think now we've learned from what's happened around climate scientists that we have, those of us who work in this space have a lot of responsibility to really help people understand the implications of big tech and what its long-term consequences might be.
So my favorite line from those hearings that you just mentioned was Mark Zuckerberg saying, "Senator, we run advertisements." Right? But actually, I have just a quick follow-up on the Facebook, and you mentioned this in passing, this advisory board, which had this nice name, the Real Facebook Advisory Board, right? That's what they, I think, called it officially. And when I saw this announced, I was actually greatly relieved to see that you are on it and that Shoshana Zuboff is on it. And I thought, wow, this looks like a great group that would actually give very healthy input into Mark Zuckerberg's thinking. And basically now you're saying nothing much is coming of that?
Okay, well, so Facebook appointed its own oversight board, and of course, nothing much has come of that. And so as a kind of a stunt, it's really, that's the most appropriate word. A number of critics and journalists who have broken some of the most important stories in the world about Facebook in particular, civil rights leaders, the leadership of Color of Change, of the NAACP, of the Anti-Defamation League. Many of us gathered to make the Real Facebook Oversight Board, which is just a way to point attention to what the Facebook Oversight Board is not doing. And also to point to the fact that the Facebook Oversight Board, for the most part, didn't really engage the most vocal critics. I mean, we have this amazing book written, by our colleague Siva Vaidyanathan at UVA, Anti-Social Media, which is one of the most important critiques of Facebook. And, I'm looking here at, my colleague Sarah Roberts' book behind the screen, exposing kind of the whole world of content moderation and the politics of social media. And none of these people are on the Facebook Oversight Board. So I think a number of us thought, well, let's make a way to bring attention to the fact that this board is really ineffectual. And it was designed, again, to help with the incredible amount of well-documented now Russian interference and propaganda and disinformation that would flood the 2020 electoral season. And here we are with no action by that board and the election just a few days away. So that's really what the Real Facebook Oversight Board is it's another platform to critique.
So the Real board is the one that was founded because the one that they had actually appointed. Okay, that's
because the real one. Yeah. So
okay.
The real one and the real one.
But then I heard that that got shut down. Was it on Facebook or on Google where it got shut down, the Real Facebook Oversight Board?
It's not shut down. I mean, it's you can't really shut it down because it's just a gathering of civil rights and, human rights concerned people who are talking to the media about the failures of Facebook and its incredibly powerful role in, bludgeoning democracy or our attempts at having a democracy. But yes, Facebook has come out very strongly against the Real Facebook Oversight Board to make it very clear that we are not in any way officially affiliated, and that is true.
Great. So we have a few questions from the audience, and I'm going to pull together a few that have similar themes.
Okay.
So if people want to learn more, could you recommend some books or authors? Can you recommend sort of advocacy organizations or alliances that are working in the space? And, what are some career paths for people who are interested in this space? How do people learn more?
How do people learn more? All right. So I think if you want to get involved in these conversations, there's so many different ways and places. So the first resource page that I'll point you to is at our center, UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. And that's C2, the number 2, the letter I, the number 2.ucla.edu. We have a resource page there, and it has a lot of important books, films. We post jobs that are happening in the field. So if people want to work in this area, you can also send us jobs that are in this space of this conversation, and we'll try to amplify. So we try to post a lot of resources there on our resource page, and that's growing every week. That's getting more robust. I think that there are people organizing at the local level. So where you can, for example, in Los Angeles, we have a really powerful and important group called Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which has been central to our understanding, for example, the incredible harms of things like predictive policing in Los Angeles. So there are local organizations like that are all over the country that are working in these kinds of local ways to make visible the harms that are happening in your local community. And I encourage people to look there. I'm trying to think, we don't, that I know of, kind of one like national clearinghouse of like how to get involved. There are certainly organizations in other countries too that are doing this work. And maybe one thing that I'll do in response to the question is try to put more of those things up at our UCLA website so that people can find them, because it's a really good question. I would say, look to people who are organizing in your community. Certainly the media justice organizations are also getting very involved in these questions of kind of big tech and media, big media, and social harm.
So just to clarify on the real Facebook oversight board, the thing I was thinking about is that Facebook actually tried to get the real Facebook oversight board's website taken offline, and somebody on Twitter posted saying nothing says free speech quite as much as a multi-billion-dollar corporation with a global monopoly getting its critics shut down and booted off the internet. So, but I guess the group itself is continuing, so that's interesting. So let's see. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the group is not going to stop. I mean, all of us are doing our work in our various different kinds of, research and data collection or journalism or, civil rights advocacy. I mean, you can't shut down the NAACP. You can't shut down Color of Change. You can't shut down UCLA or any of the places where scholars work. So, but it is a really, the response by Facebook, I think, is really to all kinds of critiques. I mean, not just the real Facebook oversight board, while simultaneously leaving wide open the channels for, let's say, white nationalists or Nazis to organize and harm people. I mean, we just saw what happened in Minnesota. We can go to Charlottesville. We can go to the way in which their platform gets used every single day to foment hate, to help people organize harm against vulnerable people. I mean, people are organized militias that are coming after African Americans, engaging in voter suppression. It is shocking, quite frankly, to see that the people who are trying to talk about that, the harm that is truly real, in the United States and in other places, and to minimize our ability to advocate for our communities, to minimize our ability to show care and regard for these egregious harms that are happening, is just shocking in order to protect its brand. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. So I think, let's put it in perspective, kind of what really is allowed by that company.
So you started off your book talking about the power of algorithms in the age of neoliberalism. And then in your remarks today, you talked about how well capitalized and profitable these companies are and really not sort of paying their fair share in taxes. And we haven't even talked about the ways in which employees are treated in, some of these companies. So what is a more ethical and more appropriate business model in this space that sort of respects workers, respects societies, respects, people of color and other ethnic and racial minorities? How do we sort of reimagine this space?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think this is where we look to, political economists. I mean, I look at people writing in this space with kind of a long view of history. People like David Harvey. I look at the work of people like Robin Kelly, historians that can help us understand that many of these companies are fundamentally, for example, antagonistic toward labor. I mean, they're powerfully involved in shutting down, firing people who would attempt to organize unions, firing people who would attempt to criticize from within. So we know that there's a very strong, kind of powerful anti-labor movement afoot that's been underway for the last 50 years in the United States. And this, of course, is very closely tied to neoliberal economic and kind of social policy, which is about elevating the rights of companies, giving companies rights and personhood, diminishing the rights of workers. And at the same time, acculturating us to think that the problems we have in terms of low wages, lack of healthcare, lack of benefits, introduction of new ideas like gig economy, right, and gig working, which is some of the most precarious kind of labor that there is in our country. These new models are the kinds of models that are being introduced, which destabilize families, neighborhoods, and people, make it harder for us to access the fundamental things that we need. And we see that so powerfully right now during the time of COVID-19, when 40 to 60 million Americans have been unemployed, have lost their health care, and don't know how they're going to survive, losing their homes. And what that makes for is a business model that allows the tech sector to make billions more dollars off the backs of this crisis. And also simultaneously kind of blame people, make people feel like they are individual failures, that they somehow didn't do life right. This is inhumane. These are inhumane ideologies and business practices that are underway right now. And I think we've got to get very serious. I love the work of people like Naomi Klein, who help us understand, again, how these models get tested out in other parts of the world, in the global South, and then brought to bear right here in our own local communities. The question is, how much can the public take? How much will we take? Unfortunately, in the US, we don't have these same kinds of models like you see in Europe of like general strikes, where we just say, hey, guess what? This is untenable. You cannot extract any more out of us. There's nothing left. So we have to figure out our response to the business model and the business as usual that's happening right now. And it is, it's a tough time, but I think this time needs to energize us and energize a powerful response.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Noble.
Thank you for having me. I just say I really appreciate this time with you. I got a chance a few, 18 months or so ago, I got a chance to visit Harvard. I was at on a panel at the Kennedy School with Professor Mar Higgs and Sarah Roberts, and we had an amazing conversation that really was very synergistic with this conversation. And so I'll post a link to that too with this talk as well, because I think these conversations are really happening and they're important to happen. And I'm so grateful to you for making a space for me to learn from you and to sit with you for a bit.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. And next month, we'll be talking with Shoshana Zuboff, author of Surveillance Capitalism.